Welcome to the panel on Community Engaged History, documenting local histories of environment and housing. My name is Aliyah Montgomery, and I'm a specialist at Stanford Libraries. I'm also an urban ethnographer. The panelists today are going to discuss how they documented housing and neighborhood conditions in various California communities. Along the way, they'll discuss how they came to do this work and how and why they engaged community members in sharing and preserving community stories. The topic of our panel is of critical importance to the lives of racialized people. Scholars have described residential segregation as the foundation and linchpin of other types of racism. Where you live, and the degree to which you have housing security, you don't have to fear being displaced, influences your access to environmental benefits such as healthy food, green spaces, support networks, high-quality schools, good jobs, and it influences your exposure to environmental dangers such as toxic waste. To help us understand housing and environment in various California communities, each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes, then we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for questions at the end. And so, without further ado, let me introduce our first panelists, Michael Kahan and Nicholas Perry. Dr. Kahan, an historian, is the co-director of Stanford's program on urban studies. He's also a senior lecturer in sociology. His interest in the historical transformation of urban space has led to publications on topics including the integration of streetcars in the 1850s, sanitation reform in the 1890s, the geography of prostitution in the 1910s, and redevelopment in California in the 1990s. His teaching includes courses on gentrification and on the history of San Francisco. He holds a bachelor's degree from Yale and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, both in history. His colleague, they're co-presenting, Nicholas Perry. Nicholas Perry serves on the board of directors of the Mountain View Historical Association, and he's the author of 2 books on the history of Mountain View, his hometown. He has a passion for the history of the built environment, and he holds a master's of city planning and bachelor's in urban studies from the University of California, Berkeley. From 2007 to 2020, he worked for the San Francisco Planning Department on his urban design team, where he designed and managed major improvements to the city's public spaces. In 2020, he joined the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority, where he is currently managing the creation of a master plan for over 1,400 acres of recently conserved public open space in Coyote Valley, south of San Jose. And so without further ado, our first panelist.
I'm Michael Kahan, and with my colleague Nick Perry, we are going to be speaking about exclusion and inclusion, race and housing in Mountain View. And we are here because of an event that's coming up in a couple of months and that has been literally a couple of years in the making now. It's an event that's scheduled for late July, specifically July 26th at the Mountain View Senior Center. It is open to the public, and we hope all of you will join us. It's called Understanding the History of Housing in Mountain View, Stories of Racism, Anti-Discrimination, and Movement Toward Inclusion. And so in our presentation today, we're going to speak about this event, about how I got involved in it, about how Nick got involved in it. We'll present some of the history that's going to be presented at the event, and we'll conclude with a few words about why we think this is all important and worthy of your attention. So just by way of some background, I moved to Mountain View in 1999 while I was still working on my PhD in urban history. And if you look very closely, you'll see I'm that little yellow dot next to, anyway. It didn't take a PhD to notice, though, that a couple of important things about the city of Mountain View. One was that it was, in many ways, a fairly diverse community, although not in every way, but also that there were some very distinct patterns to the way that this demographic diversity was distributed across the geography of the city. And you can kind of see here, there are some neighborhoods that were and are mostly white and Asian. There are others that have a significant Latino presence. And there are very few African Americans, and those that are there are also concentrated in a few neighborhoods of the city. And I became, somewhat more attuned to the background of how the city came to look this way when my wife and I bid on a house that we were thinking of buying, and we found this racial covenant, which of course, was familiar to me as an urban historian, but to be honest, I had not really thought of it as something that I would find in a post-war house in the Bay Area. So that kind of opened my eyes to some of this history in a way that I had not maybe been paying enough attention to. And when The Color of Law was published in 2017, and several cities in the Bay Area began to hold events that connected their own history to the events recounted in Rothstein's book, I began to think that it might be worthwhile to have a similar event that would be in Mountain View and that would be about the history of Mountain View and its connection to this story. And so I reached out to Ida Rose Sylvester of the Human Relations Commission in Mountain View, and she said that she thought this would be a terrific idea. She'd been thinking along similar lines herself, and she told me that in order to make it happen and to do it well, I really needed to talk to Nick Perry from the Mountain View Historical Association. And that was one of the best pieces of advice I have ever received. So I'm going to turn it over to Nick to say a little more about the association and his role in all of this.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I guess I'll start by saying a little bit about the Mountain View Historical Association. We are a small, scrappy nonprofit, I guess that's how I describe us, founded in 1954. Originally, we were the Mountain View Pioneer and Historical Association, so very much focused on the pioneers who settled Mountain View. I joined the board in 2011, and since then I've been working with my fellow board members, some of which are here today, to really expand our audience and tell diverse stories of Mountain View's past. And so I was really excited when Ida Rose connected us with Michael to work on this event together. So today I'm just going to share a little bit of the research that I did and I've shared with Michael as we were working to prepare this event. I am a city planner by training, as Aliyah mentioned, and I did a lot of my research papers in grad school and college using Mountain View as my case study. And it helped me learn about my own family's history, and I'm going to share that with you all today. So I grew up next door to my maternal grandparents, Simon and Emma Cias. That's them in this slide. My great-grandparents came to Mountain View during the Great Depression as migrant farm workers from New Mexico. My great-grandfather actually was kicked out of a mining town in New Mexico for helping to start a union for his fellow Mexican mine workers. They came to Mountain View because there were jobs here year-round in the agricultural fields and in the canneries. They settled in a neighborhood that you see marked in the yellow arrow up there, literally on the other side of the tracks from downtown Mountain View. It was originally settled by immigrants from Spain who called it La Charca de la Rana, the frog pond. And it was called the frog pond because its streets were unpaved and turned into a muddy mess during the winter, so that was their joking name for it. Because there was already a Spanish-speaking population there, when Mexican migrants started to come to Mountain View during the Depression, they naturally gravitated towards that area. It was called the Washington Street neighborhood. By the 1940s, the neighborhood was predominantly Mexican-American, and I grew up hearing stories about this close-knit community. It was a place where families processed from door to door celebrating Las Posadas during Christmas. They went down Mountain View's Main Street to celebrate the Feast Day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, going to St. Joseph's Church. They celebrated birthdays with break of dawn singings of Las Mañanitas outside their relatives' or neighbors' houses. They were encouraged by a priest at St. Joseph's, Father Donald McDonnell, to organize, and the women in the neighborhood, including my great-grandmother, founded the Club Estrella, which was originally more of a social club, but also a club that helped the needy. They also formed their own credit union because they had trouble getting loans from the banks because of discrimination. That's a newspaper clipping with my grandmother on the right saying that she doesn't like the way she looks in handwriting from the Mercury News, but it's about a credit union that they formed to form a mutual aid society for each other. The Mexican community was just one of many distinct ethnic communities in Mountain View. The city's diversity was really something that grew and became especially more visible by the mid-20th century. This series of photos is just one illustration of that. This is the city's 1950 and 1951 harvest festivals, and all the different ethnic groups put together a float. So you see the Filipino community float, the Japanese community float, the Portuguese community float, the Mexican community float, and then the whole city all gathered together at the football field at Mountain View High to watch a multicultural pageant where the different groups demonstrated their culture. So by 1950, Mountain View was an increasingly diverse city of just about 6,000 people, but big changes were on the horizon. Like the rest of Santa Clara Valley, the post-World War II growth boom swept over Mountain View. Its population swelled from 6,500 in 1950 to over 30,000 in 1960, and then by 1970 it was at 54,000. Throughout that growth boom, Mountain View pursued an aggressive housing development plan with large areas of the city zoned for multifamily residential development. The 1968 general plan projected an eventual population of 130,000 people living in the city, and we're still not there today in 2022. To facilitate this growth, massive infrastructure and roadway widening projects were initiated. One of the most dramatic was the widening of Bailey Avenue, a 2-lane residential street, into a 6-lane arterial boulevard, now known as Shoreline Boulevard. Many of you have probably driven down it. The biggest impact of that project was felt in the Mexican neighborhood that my family lived in. The county of Santa Clara built a massive interchange with Central Expressway at that intersection. 115 families were displaced by the Bailey Avenue widening project. 82% had Spanish surnames. Just to go back to that, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, their neighbors were all people who lost their homes via eminent domain for this project. So even back then, the area was experiencing a housing shortage. My grandparents and a lot of their neighbors were pushed out of Mountain View. My grandparents were only able to stay because they bought their house back from the county government and relocated it to the other side of the tracks to this neighborhood that's actually pictured here on the left, and it tells a whole nother story about Mountain View's housing policy. That neighborhood was historically mostly bungalows built in the turn of the century, but the city had a very aggressive zoning policy which allowed apartments to be built, and so that's the neighborhood I grew up in. It was, by the 1980s, a neighborhood that was majority minority. Because of the diverse housing stock, it had people of all different walks of life, people living in little cannery worker cottages, people who were just immigrants from Mexico living in the older apartment buildings, people who lived there for generations. Very diverse neighborhood because of the diversity of the housing stock. And that kind of stood in stark contrast to what was happening in some other areas on the peninsula. This flyer on the right is for the incorporation of the city of Los Altos around 1952. Los Altos, really a lot of its incorporation was focused on having control over growth and making sure that density didn't sweep over it and ruin its semi-rural atmosphere. So, if you incorporate, you'll save this spacious outdoor living of this Los Altos, or if you don't incorporate, you're going to ruin Los Altos with city living or crowded living on small lots. I think that depiction of crowded living on small lots makes the neighborhood I grew up in look like Manhattan. So the implications of that are kind of illustrated through this series of photos from Google Earth. On the left, you have Mountain View's countryside and Los Altos' countryside in 1948. Looks almost similar. It's just small houses and orchards. And then you see the stark contrast today because of the city's two different housing policies. Mountain View, that's an area that's almost predominantly apartments. It's one of the last refuges of affordability in the city. It's the California Street neighborhood for those who are familiar with Mountain View. Los Altos instituted over 78% of its land area was zoned for single-family homes, quarter-acre lot minimums. And that had big implications on who could afford to live in either community. Sorry, was I showing the wrong slide? No, okay, thank you. There we go. The demographic repercussions of these divergent housing policies have been felt now for generations. They were once especially evident at Mountain View and Los Altos in their high school district because we share a high school district. My parents met at Old Mountain View High. I am the result of one of many mixed-race relationships that started in that cultural melting pot. My mom, Gloria Cias, is the young woman on the far right of that newspaper clipping about the school's tough image in 1976. In the article, students shared how they felt other schools looked down upon Mountain View for being less affluent and more diverse. Back then, Mountain View High was located in downtown Mountain View. The other two schools in the district were less than 10% people of color, whereas Mountain View High by 1980 was over 50% people of color. And when the district started to experience declining enrollment in the 1970s and Proposition 13 passed and resulted in decreased revenues for the school districts, one of the schools had to be closed. Guess which one was closed? Mountain View High was closed, and the district used the student body of Mountain View High to integrate the other two districts, and that has that's still a sore spot for, I think, longtime Mountain View residents today. My parents at Mountain View High learned to just really embrace and love the diversity and different cultures of Mountain View, and that's something that they and their classmates and their siblings passed on to people in my generation. And so we were taught, like, we should be proud. We're from Mountain View. It's diverse. It's you know, that's part of our cultural identity. That's part of the identity of the city. And so when Michael approached us to look at the history of racism and housing in Mountain View, it's kind of with mixed emotions. On one hand, as you can see through my family's history and what happened to our neighborhood, we've experienced it firsthand. On the other hand, we're proud of the fact that Mountain View did some things right and was able to maintain its diversity for quite a long while, despite the ongoing gentrification the city faces. The story is complicated and nuanced, and that's why it's been really fun and interesting to dive into it further with Michael, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it with the community at our event, and I'll turn it back to him to wrap us up.
So with my kind of experience finding that restrictive covenant and having been immersed in urban history and works like Rothstein's, I think, as Nick indicates, I was coming at this initially with this kind of idea of a muckraking expose, you know, of the racism of Mountain View. And I think Nick and others have really helped me see this in a much more complex and kind of multidimensional way. And certainly there is a history of racism in Mountain View, and I don't think Nick or anybody, you know, denies that. And we can see that, you know, dating back to this subdivision from 1924, where only very desirable people will be allowed to purchase homes. We can trace this through the 1960s, when a majority of Mountain View voters voted to repeal the state's fair housing law in the campaign for Proposition 14, which Mountain View voters favored. We can see it in the 1970s, by which time housing discrimination was certainly illegal, both on the federal and state level, and yet a variety of housing audits and other kinds of research found that realtors and landlords in Mountain View were certainly engaged in a variety of racist practices. But we can also see a history of inclusiveness, anti-racism in the history of Mountain View. For instance, here's an item about teachers in Mountain View working against Proposition 14 to try to save the state's fair housing law. As Nick indicated, Mountain View has long had quite a rich set of high-density housing and is the only, I believe, majority renter city in Santa Clara County, and that has led to a strong tenancy movement in the city over the decades, which resulted finally in implementing rent control in Mountain View in 2016, one of the only cities in the county to have that protection. Mountain View also has a history of including below market rate housing, and here's an instance I found in the archives of a below market rate, federally subsidized housing development that was built in the early 1970s and was cited as a model for this kind of development, and a letter in the archives noted that the city was wholeheartedly supporting this development. And you can see the complexity of this story in the demographic changes of Mountain View over time. It is today a majority person of color city, and yet you can see that the Latino population has shrunk in recent years, as has the Black population, and that is almost certainly attributable to the high cost of living in the city today. Nonetheless, we were rated by this Berkeley think tank the most integrated city in the Bay Area. Now that there's limitations that go with that, and I'd be happy to talk more about what that statistic means, but it's, it's something. So let me just wrap up very briefly with why I think this story is important, and this event that we are planning for late July is something that I think carries some significance for folks here today. I think part of the significance is the way that we are interpreting history in this collaborative way between academia, local history association, and government commission. I think it's also significant the way that we are doing this research in a way that I think can serve future purposes of pursuing social justice, and using research into the history of housing, I think, can lay the groundwork for future work of the kind that's been done, for example, in Evanston, Illinois, to consider reparations for past housing discrimination. We also, I think, are opening history to new voices and new places, looking at a place like Mountain View and kind of elevating its significance in an environment where big cities tend to get most of the attention, but smaller cities and suburbs like Mountain View, I think, are really important for telling a wider variety of stories. And finally, we are going to be using this event in July to communicate history to new audiences that might not buy, an academic book or pick up an academic journal, but I think by including residents of the city and neighboring cities, we are going to be able to bring this story to people who may not, frankly, be familiar with it at all. And I think that will be an achievement. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'm going to wrap it up there, but we'd be happy to learn from you during the Q&A, especially anyone who has experience either with an event like this or doing research on these topics. We'd love to learn more from you. Thanks.
Our next presenter is going to be Dr. Carol Lynn McKibben. She's an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. She's been teaching courses in California history, urban history, and immigration history for the Department of History and Urban Studies at Stanford University since 2006, and she's currently an affiliate lecturer with the Bill Lane Center for the American West. She's also engaged in numerous community-based research projects on the Monterey Peninsula for 30 years. Today, she's going to discuss her beautifully written third and most recent book, Salinas, A History of Race and Resilience in an Agricultural City, that was published by Stanford University Press.
And this is Alicia's book that was just published. It's terrific, and I highly recommend it. Thank you also to Aliyah, whose work I have come to admire and appreciate over the past couple of years, and always to Michael, who just spoke to my heart. That was a great presentation, and I see a lot of common threads, and whose leadership as Associate Director in Urban Studies is a model of inclusion and support that I've been privileged to enjoy for years. So the book I just published, Salinas, A History of Race and Resilience. Oh, Angie Gomez and Matt Jacquez were also part of the research for this book, so I just want to acknowledge that. This book spans a period of 2.5 centuries, and it focuses on the development of Salinas, California, which is an urban center located in one of the richest, most demographically complex agricultural regions in California. So my work is completed rather than in progress, and a wide-ranging study rather than focused on a particular issue. That said, our panel decided to zero in on housing as a point of comparison in these 3 different California regions. So I'm going to use my time to discuss how housing serves as a window into inequality in California. But first, I kind of want to set the stage a little bit about Salinas and describe a couple of the sources that help me understand the city a little bit better. Salinas has a population of about 160,000 out of a total county population of about 500,000. It's the most important urban center in Monterey County and in the Central Coast region. It's 75% Latinx, primarily Mexican, Mexican-American, and Central American, 16% white, 7% Asian and Pacific Islander, 2% African-American, 1% Native American. Salinas is situated at the head of the rich agricultural region known as the Salinas Valley. It's about 17 miles inland from Monterey Bay and about 100 miles south of San Francisco. It encompasses some of the wealthiest cities in California and the nation: Carmel, Pebble Beach, Santa Barbara, and some of the poorest: Seaside, Marina, the smaller towns of the Salinas Valley. Salinas embodies both ends of this economic spectrum. It was one of those places created as an American incorporated city by multiple groups and as part of a regional San Francisco project, and it was supported by railroad building after the end of the war with Mexico in 1848. It was also the site of some of the fiercest labor battles in American history. Home to multiple racial and ethnic communities, divided internally by class and stage of migration, but that lived side by side in a kind of complex tension, coexisting, accommodating a normative American white racial hierarchy, yet always nipping at its heels. Salinas shows us how a typical American city located in a rural agricultural setting struggled to sustain a complex social order, all the while facing some of the most difficult challenges and biggest crises in American life in the 20th and 21st centuries. This is not a linear history of progress or decline. It's a story of tension throughout the centuries. I was lucky. I had access to sources that had been denied to scholars previously for a variety of reasons, but mostly I came to realize just embarrassment. I often worked in places that were filled with just stacks of paper and files, disorganized and certainly not archived. Yet I got into them nonetheless. And 2 sources in particular gave me invaluable insight into land use and also into the way land became racialized and a privileged commodity for whites. First, the minutes of the Grower-Shipper Association meetings, dating from the 1930s, were remarkably complete and unvarnished records of what was going on behind closed doors. I loved this. One of my finds relating to land use, for example, was an exchange in 1932 among white members discussing Japanese members who were absent purposefully. Land rentals were discussed, the secretary recorded. It was pointed out that some 6,000 acres now in sugar beet would be open to lettuce growers, but, and I'm quoting, most likely the Japanese would take all such lands. So the white growers launched a general investigation into the legality of Japanese leases that might, as they said, eliminate some of this competition, and suggested that the alien land law be enforced in this district, which resulted in the president of the Grower-Shipper Association contacting the district attorney's office to see if that could be done. So even though Japanese American growers were included as members of this organization, and they found ways to kind of own land, land was a precious commodity in Salinas, and whites were determined to control it, as they clearly expressed here. Second, all these little newspapers, including the Salinas Independent, a self-described union newspaper, and other ethnic newspapers as well, only available in hard copy, offered a window into perceptions, goals, and views of diverse groups of Salinas residents over time that helped me understand how much home and business ownership meant to everyone. I also found a little nugget. A notice posted by the Interracial Council of Monterey in 1946, who were concerned with the problem of housing racial minorities. They organized a meeting and included the showing of the Frank Sinatra film, The House I Live In, which was one of the few Hollywood films challenging racism. Actually, it was challenging anti-Semitism, but still. So they purposefully invited local Salinas realtors to the film as a consciousness-raising exercise. So the idea of exclusionary housing in Salinas was not a straight line. It suggested that there were challenges along the way. I also looked at advertisements in these papers, just like Michael did, but I'll return to that later. The most valuable insights I gained about the impact of segregation in both home ownership and the creation of marginalized spaces in the city came from rich oral histories, very much like Nick's family. Not because people tell the truth or even are reliable sources, even when they're eyewitnesses, as my colleague Richard White would remind me, but because perspectives matter. When I looked through the eyes of a little girl, Blanche Atai, born in Salinas' Chinatown in 1921, I learned a lot more about the meaning of racism and segregation in housing. Her father was a merchant, not a contract laborer, as we commonly assume, and her mother was a matriarch, attending to the needs of less prosperous community members, just like white women were doing at the time, although she was never invited to join their clubs. Salinas' Chinatown may have been a racially marginalized space, but it was also socioeconomically diverse, made up of families who owned their homes in the late 19th century and forward through the 1950s. Blanche Atai described her world, just like your family, as the other side of the tracks, separate from the main residential area of Salinas. So she knew very well she lived in a marginalized space which was racially segregated. Yet she recalled the Salinas rodeo with great enthusiasm as a moment of cultural inclusion that made her feel like she was part of the community, not apart from it. She attended an integrated public school. She noted that her Chinatown, unlike so many barrios and Chinatowns all up and down the coast of California, had paved streets, sidewalks, and streetlights, just like other Salinas residential neighborhoods. Her perspective, echoed by others from her community and other ethnic communities too, signified a sense of inclusion that belied real racism in segregated housing at work here. Today, Salinas is, and this is a photograph of a dance party during rodeo season that was very multiracial. Today, Salinas' Chinatown is both a degraded space, a destination for the homeless, but it's also a contested and changing environment. One group of Salinas residents who trace their family origins to the 19th century, the Asian cultural experience, are activists working to preserve its legacy and update its infrastructure. Salinas' Chinatown's roots, the history of this shows how complicated this was. It was hardly a picture of undeviating neglect by the city or its residents, but it was also racially segregated and marginalized throughout. We might imagine from our textbooks that places like Chinatown, marginalized and multiracial, were integrated within. Not always true, as Salinas showed. The area known as Alisal, or East Salinas, one of the poorest and most racially segregated places in Salinas, also had historically strict racial restrictions against all minorities in its recent history. The east side, or Alisal, was a flat, wide, open place with plenty of land available to almost anyone willing to build a house or start a farm or business within limits. Multiple immigrants and native-born groups of people of Chinese, Filipino, Mexican, Japanese, African, and European descent took advantage of that as they sought upward mobility throughout the 20th century. But only whites among them, even Dust Bowl migrants, managed to reach the class of ag billionaires, with a couple of notable exceptions among Japanese immigrants post-1965. Elementary school teacher Susan Aremus described herself this way. "I know I'm American," she said, "but I don't look American. And my parents aren't American, so it was a struggle." Her family began life in Salinas as field workers and rented in Alisal, but found year-round employment in the new industries that located in the city in the post-war, and that allowed them enough money to buy a home. In 1948, when the family tried to buy a home in Alisal, we found, she said, that there were petitions being sent around to bar us from living there. The people who objected were mostly whites from Oklahoma. Susan remembered her parents fighting back. "My parents said, 'We also deserve this.' They told our friends, 'Come on over and we'll try to break through.' They did, but they had to overcome financing hurdles like Nick described and Michael. Filipinos and other racial minorities were completely ineligible for federal loans at that time, and she vividly recalled areas of Salinas that were absolutely closed to Filipinos and anyone of Mexican descent. Advertisements for home sales in those local newspapers that I mentioned, in Salinas and in Alisal, validated her family's story, as did other narrative accounts. Homes were advertised as beautiful and attractive and modern when they were in a restricted subdivision or a restricted district or tract. By contrast, places that were not racially restricted were advertised in much less glowing terms as a good buy, or that could be sold to any nationality. Other ads specifically mentioned Filipinos and Mexicans could buy. Filipinos and Mexicans can buy here, suggesting that these were the exceptions. That's one of my favorite photographs. Beginning in the 1970s, massive new migrations of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans of every socioeconomic class arrived in Salinas as part of the Chicano-Chicana civil rights movement, and mostly lived in Alisal, which is now almost 95% Latinx. As Salinas developed its now infamous prison system, however, adjacent to this community, Alisal became one of the most neglected and overcrowded areas of the city, segregated by race and by class. And these are a couple of maps that show that. The green area of Alisal is almost entirely Latinx. The yellow area is white. The blue area is Asian. The striped area to the left is Asian and black. And the pinkish area is Asian, black, and white. So that's the only area that's really multiracial in the city. And class-wise, there's a correlation here. Yellow denotes the poorest areas, and that's mostly on the east side. It was also battered by a confluence of economic impacts, including the loss of federal and state funding that made even minimal development and infrastructure almost impossible. But at the same time, this new migration propelled a new generation of Latinx lawmakers into positions of power in the city, including the first ever Latino city council member, Simon Salinas, on the right, who moved into the South Side, and he said, "I was the only Mexican person in my neighborhood, and it was really hard." And that was in the 90s. That was in the 1990s. And the first Latina mayor, Ana Caballero, both of whom became important narrators for this book, and both of whom vigorously fought for equity throughout Salinas and investment in Alisal and East Salinas. All of their activism culminated in the Alisal Vibrancy Plan, which our own former Urban Studies Associate Director Deland Chan and I engaged in as a partnership with our Stanford classes, local community college students, and the city of Salinas itself. This plan, first and foremost, queried residents themselves in Spanish to identify areas of concern in Salinas, starting with that population clustering that was associated with socioeconomic inequality, but also considered transportation system, the availability of parks and bike paths, recreation centers, access to food and health care, which became glaring during this recent pandemic. This was a grassroots and inclusive effort from its inception that first and foremost showed how deeply rooted residents were, not just to Salinas, but also to Alisal. This was home, not a liminal space to escape from. Even as the city incorporates community voices to make change from the grassroots, and Salinas city culture remains inclusive, reflecting its very strong Latinx population. Its history as a city lays bare the way inequality in housing and other things played out over time. It's often complicated, it's often in disguise, but it is sustained nonetheless, which sounds depressing. But there it is. Thank you so much. I just want to add a little note quickly. I recently gave a talk in Salinas, and a young man came up to me and said he had grown up there, and until he got older, he didn't realize that Spanish was considered a foreign language in this country. So that says a lot. Thank you.
So our final presenter is Aliyah Dunn-Salahuddin, who's currently a PhD candidate of history at Stanford University. Prior to entering Stanford University, she earned both her bachelor's and MA in American history at San Francisco State University. She went on to become tenured faculty at City College of San Francisco, where she taught both African American and United States history. Her current research interests are focused on the intersection of racial inequality, environment, and infrastructure in San Francisco Bayview-Hunters Point, and more generally, the African American experience in the United States. Aliyah is also a performing artist, very talented, I should add, interested in using public history and the arts to make local histories more accessible to people outside academia. Her most recent publication is A Forgotten Community, A Forgotten History, San Francisco's 1966 Uprising, which appeared as a chapter in an edited anthology, The Strange Careers of the Jim Crow North, Segregation and Struggle Outside the South, which was published by NYU Press in 2019.
Thank you. So it's important for me to go over, many people are unfamiliar with Bayview-Hunters Point in San Francisco, so I'm going to use today to talk more about the history, and then if you guys have questions about the methodology and how I've incorporated both oral histories and engaged the community, I'd be happy to do that in the Q&A. Okay, so let's start. So I descend from George and Artis Lloyd, who were sharecroppers from Kilgore, Texas. By 1930, Artis Lloyd was widowed for reasons unknown, and we can fill in the blank. I have no idea why. And Artis Lloyd, along with my great aunts, came here and had my mother in 1951 in San Francisco. And that's how I started to study this history. So this research, the ecology, environment, race, and infrastructure in San Francisco's Bayview-Hunters Point, historicizes the relationship of disenfranchised people to the physical and structural realities that have shaped their lives. struggles for access to and improved conditions of housing clearly exemplify how the philosophies and strategies of civil rights were shaped by the lived experiences or by the lived environments of the disenfranchised, and how social and racial inequality were translated both materially and structurally over time. I want to bring your attention to this map, as you can see here. Well, let me keep going, and then I'll talk about this in just a second. The Black protest politic that developed in San Francisco was directly shaped by the relationship of the people to the land that they inhabited, and their desire to maintain place through the improvement and development of housing, a common thread in all of the presentations here. The struggle continues as Black San Franciscans organize to maintain both place and secure healthy and non-toxic environments. But those spatial and environmental yearnings have historically been stymied by the city's lack of will to improve the conditions of its low-income public housing communities, hidden within the city's iconic landscapes that many of us are familiar with. But beyond the full house houses or the cable cars or the rice-a-roni that we're all familiar with, there are real people that are more diverse with real stories that hold national and international significance. So a history of Hunters Point redevelopment filtered through the lives of local community activists allows us to bridge urban developmental processes with the freedom struggles of ordinary and often unseen working class historical actors. So Bayview-Hunters Point, as you can see, is in the southeast corner of San Francisco, where, as you see, inequality has historically been concentrated. I also want to bring your attention to the Western Addition, is how I knew it. Now it's north of Panhandle, and a million other names that real estate developers have renamed it, and that's a part of the erasure process. But this was traditionally a predominantly African-American neighborhood. My grandmother had a house on California in between Baker and Lion Street, which is now worth probably $5 million today that we are no longer in possession of. So while the Fillmore is often a catch-all for the entire Black San Francisco experience, we have to move beyond the Fillmore to fully comprehend the history of Black San Francisco. There are other Black neighborhoods and communities in San Francisco, and that's why I'm talking about Bayview-Hunters Point today. So we must place the Fillmore into a broader Black urban geography, and Bayview-Hunters Point is an important part of that geography. Black San Francisco is not homogeneous, although often presented as such. Okay, so Bayview is comprised of, I'd say, two parts. Bayview is predominantly homeowners or home renters, residential family homes. Much of it looks like this. Any iconic, beautiful neighborhood in San Francisco. The important thing is location and geography. This is within walking distance of vital transportation, businesses, and services. Hunters Point, the former area of the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, is the opposite. It sits atop of the hill, and Hunters Point sits atop a tiered hillside of rock, cement, dirt, and fence, isolated on a series of intersecting steeped hills with little access to services, stores, or resources. I grew up at 100 West Point for several years of my life, maybe elementary school and some change. And so there was this, just to give you a sense, people sold things out of their houses, you know, so we could have access to things, whether they be nachos or toilet paper or candy. Very isolated and in stark contrast. Nonetheless, Bayview-Hunters Point as a community, there is not a separation, although there is a class difference. So in 2007, this barrack-style public housing was ranked by the federal inspectors as among the worst public housing in the country. Hunters Point was originally constructed as a joint effort between the San Francisco Housing Authority and the U.S. Navy to provide much-needed temporary, quote, and I put quotes on temporary because it eventually becomes permanent. Permanent for whom, when, and why are important questions to ask. For those employed or contracted at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. The San Francisco Housing Authority, established in 1938, is one of the oldest housing authorities in California and the 17th largest housing authority in the country. So the happenings of the San Francisco Housing Authority, both in Hunters Point and beyond, have deep national implications and set a model. So again, these local histories having national implications that often go unrecognized, I think is very important for us to pay attention to. Hunters Point is but one of many examples of the post-war communities hidden in San Francisco's landscape, whether you're looking at Potrero Hill, or where O.J. Simpson grew up, or Alamany. So if you're driving on the freeway, you see these types of houses. There are people that still live there, and they've been there for 50 plus years. And Hunters Point is a part of that. And many people, they're still inhabited by people, although they've been renovated. In 1956, 267 of these temporary barrack-style houses were converted into a public housing project by the San Francisco Housing Authority, and by the mid-1960s, a specific set of public housing residents were politicized because of the deteriorating conditions of these houses, allowing them to act as leaders for the entire Bayview-Hunters Point community and represent, as we go into the early 1970s, similar communities like Bayview-Hunters Point across the nation in places like Congress and DC by the time we get to 1973. So again, these are women, these are mothers, these are working class people who are advocating for better housing conditions in the communities that they live in. But let's look back to understand what history became sedimented into the land, and also to understand the space that this made this place that these predominantly African-American people lived within. Okay, so let's go to the war years. So on June 25th, 1953, it was reported that the San Francisco Naval Shipyard at Hunters Point is the city's largest industrial plant. Its workforce of over 10,000 takes pride, it was quoted. So originally, the people who come to inhabit Hunters Point were naval personnel, which included African Americans and Filipino and Vietnamese and others, although in smaller numbers, and it was strictly for those people. By the time we get to the early 1950s, we see that the Fillmore is becoming overcrowded, the war is coming to a close, and as these naval personnel are moving out into the suburbs, Hunters Point is taken over by the San Francisco Housing Authority and seen as a viable solution to this housing issue. I also want to make note, and I'm kind of going off the notes here, but that's fine. I also want to make note that the San Francisco Housing Authority implemented, and this was alluded to a little earlier in David Rothstein's work, what was called a neighborhood pattern, basically segregating people who were Chinese and blacks to very specific housing project communities. Now, these projects, as we call them today, weren't always seen as negative places to be. They were quite nice, and they were heavily sought after. So I think it's important, but the shipyard itself greatly shapes the infrastructure and the lives of the people that would come to inhabit what will become a low-income public housing community that by the time we get to the 60s and 70s deteriorates. So this is an overhead view of the naval shipyard. Basically, all of the ships, I'll talk more about it in the presentation before I get excited about the history, so we'll keep going. I think it's in there. I also want to bring attention to the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory, which functioned at the shipyard which operated, at the shipyard between 1947 and 1946 and 1969. This was part of that military infrastructure. There was testing that involves the use of unsealed radioactive isotopes collected and disposed of manually. And in 1956, after 10 years of operations, concerns were raised. So I'm bringing our attention to the land itself because I think it's very important for us to understand not only that people fought for land, but what constituted the land itself and what were the consequences of the military-industrial complex in the San Francisco Bay Area and other coastal cities in the West. This was a major factor that shaped the West Coast that often goes overlooked. It's ironic to me now that there are condos selling for $500,000 in this area on land that we have no idea how contaminated it actually is. In 2000, there was an underground fire, that chemical fire that burned there. So contested land, contested space, as Professor McKibben pointed to. So Leon Leventhal, a chemist at the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory, is quoted as saying, "The building at present does not incorporate any specific features to present the accidental release of airborne or liquid-borne waste. Until precautions were made, the laboratory would have no record of the liquid-borne radioactive contamination that is discharged into a sewer system, also into the bay. Carcasses of animals who were tested on were buried there. nor any record of the airborne contamination that is discharged into the atmosphere. So, so these are the toxic consequences that the generation that would follow the Great Migration would have to suffer, and that the community still continues to suffer with. But let's go back to see the struggle to maintain place before we talk about the environment. In 1962, there was a march to City Hall because these houses were scheduled to be demolished. So this small but mighty group of residents fight to maintain place. I want us to notice how they're dressed. I want us to notice how they're presenting themselves. I want us to notice how they're asserting themselves within the city municipality, walking straight into City Hall, and they were successful in maintaining place in San Francisco. And so this is one of the earliest, I would say, nonviolent forms of protest that we see surrounding housing in San Francisco, if we're excluding like legal cases and things of that matter, which often frame the Black freedom struggle. But I also think we need to look to the ground, to what people in local communities are doing to understand how change is constituted. The conditions continue to deteriorate, although people are able to maintain place. This is from the Spokesman, a local paper. That black is not shade, that is fungus in the apartments that tenants lived in. Now, we all know how unhealthy this is, but these are children and these are babies. So for me, there's a direct correlation between health, contamination in the environment, and also the land that people are on and what they're fighting for. It shapes how it shapes their fight and what they're fighting for, which is very important. By 1965, we see African Americans become more politicized, and they decide to take over the San Francisco Housing Authority meeting October 7th in 1965 in response to not just the conditions, but also their treatment by the San Francisco Housing Authority. And they were successful in this as well, but this is history that we do not know. So taken from the Spokesman, the paper, an overflow crowd representing tenants, unions, block clubs, church groups, and many organizations heard the Housing Authority accused of failures in dealing with problems of pest control, repairs, services, unjust or degrading rules and regulations, and insufficient concern for tenants as people. So this is about humanity. This is about living with dignity, which we can connect to, paradigms of the American dream. All of this is really important history that is often overlooked because we're not looking through the lens of housing. And here's another image of them taking over that special meeting. Okay. Later, the following year in 1966, galvanized by the Watts Uprising, many people sort of increased their fight and struggle for housing. Now, this phone protest, and you guys can see a little leaflet that was copied and passed out, is in response to some Ollie Wallace, a resident, being forcefully removed from his house after paying his rent, but not paying the late fees, and people stage a sit-in and stop him from being evicted from his house in front of the sheriff. So I just wanted to see these examples of the kinds of things that people were doing on the ground. So this idea of, say, I want freedom to live, we can connect that to the Black Panther Party, we can connect that to Black nationalism. These are all very important things for us to consider in terms of what does change look like, how is it constituted, and just people asking for basic things like housing. Okay. By the fall of 1966, after the fatal shooting of Matthew Peanut Johnson by a police officer, Bayview-Hunters Point erupts in a 3-day uprising, and that brings attention to the inequality in the area. There's more history around that, and this is a picture of Matthew Peanut Johnson, who died in 1966. Thousands of people attended his funeral, and they actually narrowed down and buckled down on their struggle for housing and maintain place after this. By 1971, there is a growing environmental consciousness, as you guys see exemplified by Marvin Gaye's song, Mercy, Mercy Me, and there are more environmental concerns as a result of the toxic legacy left over by things like the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory, the sandblasting, all the things that were happening there on the Naval Shipyard up until 1974. So here's a list of just some of the things that are dumped into Bayview. Bayview-Hunters Point today still acts as San Francisco's dumping ground, and historically has been the place where the industry is. So from 80% of the wastewater in San Francisco is processed in Bayview-Hunters Point. When I would ride the school bus home, I would smell French bread, very ironic being in San Francisco, and then the smell of feces from the sewage plant right near there. The Parisian bread factory bled into the sewage plant. Diesel fuel from the taxis, the school bus yards, and others, and you guys can see here without having to go through this whole list. This is a view today. You guys can see on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge, the views that we have. This is how some people are living, and this beautiful community is still used as a dump site today. So I want to close by saying a few words, and then I want us to look at this quote by Eloise Westbrook, one of those many activists who are in Bayview-Hunters Point. So out of the sight of the iconic cable car turnarounds and tourist-filled wharfs, San Francisco's low-income public housing communities existed on the other side of the view. In San Francisco, the haves shared the same view as the have-nots. They were merely on the opposite side of a mirror, blinded by the orange vermilion of the Golden Gate Bridge. The plight of San Francisco's non-white working class was rendered invisible, and in many ways still is rendered invisible. Tourists have no idea that they're taking snapshots of a beautiful yet structurally inequitable social political landscape, and the struggles of public housing communities, like those in Hunters Point, reveal grassroots strategies for institutional change and show that small groups of people were able to wield substantial amounts of political power, and they are still here. The last black woman, the last black man narrative is not true. There are still black San Franciscans. I'm from San Francisco, and I think you guys all read this already, right, on your own, and I love how she talks about her sometimes broken window, and I think that's a larger metaphor for San Francisco. Sometimes it's broken, but it's ours, and we're still here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have a question for our second panelist. I took down notes on sort of what you were talking about with Mountain View and how it's decreased in diversity, especially with Black and Hispanic populations. And sort of correlated that with the tech growth in the area, rising housing prices. And then I kind of want to look at Salinas, and I know that it's going to become this agricultural tech capital of the world. That's sort of what the future is, right?
Yeah.
So how do you see like that influx of money going in there going to change housing there?
It already is. That's part of Alice L. Vibrancy Plan, right, Angie? Angie lives in Salinas, so you can also weigh in whenever you feel like it. There's a lot of money in Salinas. It's interesting that the Monterey Peninsula is known for tourism, right? A $2 billion industry. Agriculture in Salinas is a $4 billion industry. A lot of those agriculturalists came right out of the Dust Bowl, and they moved just on the outskirts, so their taxes are not benefiting the city, really, but they're still putting money into the city in other ways. So gradually, it is being redeveloped, but there are all kinds of issues that play out there. It's very politically intense, and water now on the peninsula is a huge drawback to investment in places like Alisal, which desperately need it. So there's a lot of conflict over that. So that's my new research project. But not Silicon Valley. It's called Ag Tech. That's what they call themselves. And Steve Forbes came down a few years ago and said, "This is the Ag Tech capital of the world." There is a ton of money here, and some of it's being reinvested. But my argument in my book is that largesse is still largesse, right? So it's not taxed. It's not people have moved the people with money have moved just far out of the city so that their money is protected from the rest of the city. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Other questions?
I actually have a quick question for the audience. Does anybody have a story about finding housing, getting housing, working for inclusion in Mountain View? Because we are collecting people's stories as part of this project. So if I'll just have a set of these flyers that Ida Rose Sylvester helpfully brought with her. If you have a story to share about racism or anti-racism in Mountain View housing, please take one of these. The survey is available in 4 languages, and we would love to hear your input as part of this event.
And I also wanted, like, am I putting you on the spot, Angie? Did you have something, a follow-up?
Yeah, like you mentioned the outskirts, I had like whispered under my breath, like, oh my God, it's, oh, okay, thank you. When Professor McKibben mentioned like the outskirts, I was like, oh, Spreckles, and all like these like little towns, like that aren't really towns, that just are significantly like have money. Like I've like my sister is in high school there, so like she has teachers who like live outside of Salinas. I think most teachers in Salinas actually don't live in Salinas. And also most teachers are like not like Latinx or like Black, or they're mostly also white, so like that says about where they live. I'm also just like in the audience, so I don't want to.
Okay, well, no, but Angie, you're part of it.
Thank you.
This one's for Aliyah. I was conflicted. I had not heard the aspect about the contaminated housing, and that picture with the black mold is very disturbing. So I was wondering, should they be fighting to live in these deplorable conditions, or?
Right, that's a good question. And, you know, for me, it's about, so on one hand, imagine you're a migrant coming from the West, and you've come so far, the longest route. And at the end of the day, you've literally come to the water's edge, you know, and that brings me sort of, so where do you go? So I think the Bayview-Hunters Point story speaks to the limits of migration and movement as a tool for liberation, that there's only so far that you can go, and which is why I want to bring in the land and the environment, because if the environments that people are moving in compromise their health, is it worth it? And, you know, my grandparents had no idea that that was going to be a consequence. It was jobs, it was housing. So I think that is what the current community is trying to reconcile now. I've done oral histories with people, and one elder who did a lot of work in the community was like, we did all that work so you guys could get out if you wanted, buy a house somewhere else. And others who feel like Bayview is home and this is where I'm going to stay. And I think you see this same sort of tension in other areas, like places in New Orleans, where we're living in this area that is dangerous for us to be in, but this is home. So I think these are questions that as we go into an environmentally insecure future, more and more disenfranchised communities are gonna have to ask. And the San Francisco, you know, housing authority's credit, there has been improvement in the housing. More people have been moved out than have come back in, but it's like they made it nice for who and for when. And so, yeah, I think you raise a really good point and question about our environmental future.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the construction of this panel in some ways, because you all represent different kinds of communities in California, a city but really influenced by the rural kind of agricultural kind of environment. San Francisco, which people think of as strictly urban. And then you have Mountain View, which I would characterize before Silicon Valley as really more suburban, maybe edging on rural, but really now more suburban. And so housing is always seems to be, at least in my history, a really major problem with everybody in California, in the Bay Area, et cetera. But the question is, are the solutions really need to be local, or is there enough overlap in solutions where state or regional kinds of approaches or strategies can actually somehow crack this housing situation? So what do you learn and hear from each other to kind of help craft some solutions or approaches for the future?
For you to tackle first. That's the city planner.
Yes, we have a city planner.
Oh, that's a great question. Sorry, I don't know. I guess I can take the mic off and so I can face you. And Michael and others, please chime in. But that's kind of what I was trying to get at a little bit with my comparison of Mountain View and Los Altos. there's only so much one jurisdiction can do, especially when it's a small jurisdiction. What happens regionally is going to impact housing and affordability much more than what one tiny city can do. And so I think your point is well taken. Like, there's only so much. We have to look at this problem regionally in order to solve it, because if we're all just solving for what our specific municipality wants or what type of character we want to preserve, it's going to have repercussions across the border.
I mean, I would just add, yes, we need regional solutions. I think we also probably need federal solutions. I mean, if we're talking about issues of discrimination, for example, we've had a fair housing law, and that's a federal law since 1968, but the enforcement is very weak and toothless. There's, very little has been done to undo the legacy of the legalized discrimination that, date much further back than that. So, yeah, I think there's a need for thinking about this at multiple scales.
Yeah, and I think,
go ahead.
I was going
No,
to say,
I
to bring in
insist.
the psychology of it, that last quote, they were at a congressional hearing in D.C. in 1973 with a bunch of other housing communities. So I think that there was this sort of fomenting of this broader national movement that was thwarted by, a change in administration and just the shifts that happened and the lack of federal, will to even do anything once we get into the early 70s. But yeah.
And I'll second all of their motions because I really believe that change can only happen from the top down, bottom up, and sideways. We need nonprofits, we need grassroots, we need federal will and policy change. We also need the state to weigh in. And I think increasingly, we are looking more regionally than locally to understand that things like this are really complicated. But all of those entities play a really significant role. And no one of them can do it by themselves in isolation. So it does take activism from everybody.
It's 5 o'clock now. Please join me in applause for our presenters.
Thank you, Alicia.